Hi, this is Steve Yee, Director of Product Management for SQL Azure. This walkthrough will show how you can easily migrate data from Microsoft Access to SQL Azure. By moving your data to SQL Azure, you gain the ability for multiple users to access the data from anywhere on the internet without making changes to the Access application. You also ensure your data is always available when adding the ability to expose data to additional users via a web or mobile application in the future. In addition, moving workloads to the cloud preserves your investments and ownership in existing applications, yet doesn't impose additional requirements on central IT. Let's start with an existing Access application tracking employee expenses locally on a desktop machine. We will then use the SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access, or SSMA for short, to migrate the data to SQL Azure. Finally, we will show how no changes are required to continue using the Access application after the data migration. So let's start with looking at an existing Access application that was built with Access 2007. This simple application is used to record, track, and approve employee expense reports. It allows employee expense reports to be entered into the application and then approved for payment. There are two main sections to the application: an employee list where the user can manage employees, and a list of the expenses submitted for employees that can be filtered based on approval status. We can add new expense reports for employees by clicking here. Notice that there is some custom code validation in this form. For example, the report date cannot be a future date. And you'll also notice some fields here that are related to the approval of the expenses. But for now, let's just enter the expense report details and identify the approver. And then click Close. We now see the new expense report we added in our list. Let's go ahead and close this application and migrate our data to SQL Azure Database. To handle the migration of the data for this application to SQL Azure Database, we can use the SQL Server Migration Assistant, or SSMA. If you don't have a SQL Azure account yet, go ahead and sign up for one now by visiting www.sqlazure.com. This tool is free and can be found at the URL on your screen. So let's go ahead and download the SQL Server Migration Assistant. And we will choose SSMA 2008. SSMA for Access supports migration from Access 97 and higher to SQL Server 2005 or 2008 and also SQL Azure. Now let's unzip the exe file from this zip and run it to install the program. Click Next, choose Accept and then Next, click Next, and then click Complete. Go ahead and click Install, and then click Finish. Okay, let's now run the migration tool. The first time you run the tool, you'll be asked to supply a license file. The license is free, but a simple form needs to be completed by using your Windows Live ID. Once the migration assistant starts, we can walk through the wizard to move our expense data to SQL Azure Database. Let's enter a name for our migration project and ensure that we select SQL Azure as our destination data store. Now we are prompted to select the Access file where our data is stored. So let's click Add Databases and browse to the file, select it, and click Next. Now we have to identify what data is being moved. In our demonstration, we want to move all data tables in the Access database, so let's make sure they are selected. Now we need to enter the credentials for the SQL Azure database that we want to store our data in. So let's go and do that first. Since we haven't created the SQL Azure database, which will store our data, let's do this now. Browse to windows.azure.com and click the Create Database icon. Click OK and switch back to the wizard. Complete the details and click Next. Now we are given the option to automatically update our Access application to link to SQL Azure instead of local tables. So let's do that. We simply need to check the Link Tables checkbox. The Convert, Load, and Migrate process will then run. The wizard will check the database to see what objects already exist, and will then allow us to choose what data to move. As you can see, there are 4 tables locally that do not exist in SQL Azure. The default action is to move the local data to SQL Azure, just as we want, so let's just click OK. The wizard will then create the required database objects in SQL Azure and migrate all of the data. The last step in this process is to update the Access application to link to the tables in SQL Azure. To do this, the wizard will again prompt you for your SQL Azure credentials. Re-enter your SQL Azure password and then click Connect. A warning will be displayed to indicate that the password to SQL Azure will be stored as plain text in the Access file. Click Yes to allow the wizard to do this. And that's it. We're done. No errors were reported with the migration. However, I noticed that there are a number of warnings associated with the first step, so let's scroll up a little and look at those. To view the warnings, just click on the Report button inside the warnings. This shows a nice summary of the migration process, including details on the warnings. As you can see, there are only 2 types of warnings. The first type of warning is that hyperlink columns in Access were converted to text columns in SQL Azure. And the second is a warning that some of the table or column names may cause a problem. This warning is mainly due to spaces in the name. Both of these warnings are fine with me, so let's just click the Close button. Now that the data is migrated to SQL Azure Database, let's reopen our Access application and make sure everything still works. All of the data is pulled from the SQL Azure Database. Everything appears to work properly. Now let's run a few tests. We can add a new expense report and make sure that we can find that expense report via a query in SQL Azure. Also, let's make sure our custom data validation rules haven't changed as a result of the migration. So let's click New Expense Report. Now we will enter a future report date to make sure we see the custom date validation. Sure enough, we see that this business rule hasn't changed. Now let's fill out the rest of this report. We will use an expense code of 199. And as we can see, the new expense is added to our expense list. Okay, let's make sure this new expense is available in SQL Azure through the SQL Azure Database Manager. So let's go there. And I'll enter my SQL Azure password and click Connect. So let's run a new query and find the expense report we just added. And type select star from expense reports where expense code equals 199 and click Execute. As you can see, the new expense report is displayed. And by querying the expense reports database in SQL Azure directly, we've verified that the data is being stored up in the cloud. So in summary, as we walk through how to easily move data in your Microsoft Access application to SQL Azure while maintaining your original Access functionality. With your data in SQL Azure, you gain the ability for multiple users to access the data from anywhere on the internet without changes to the Access application, but ensure that your data is globally accessible, highly available, and redundant. You also gain the ability to expose the data to additional users via a web or mobile application in the future. Thanks for watching. Please visit SQLazure.com for the latest information and resources.